Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I am Kemper Donovan, and in this episode, I will be interviewing Gillian Gill, the author of Agatha Christie, The Woman and Her Mysteries. And when I teased this interview in the last episode, one of you actually reached out to me and let me know that it was this very book of Gillian Gill's that convinced them over 20 years ago there was more to Agatha than her popularity, as indeed we all know by this point. And I think that we owe a little bit of a debt to Gillian Gill because she was one of the first people who was making that argument. And I'm so excited to have been able to have the conversation with her about her book and Agatha Christie. And I just want to say before I launch into this interview that the reason I was able to make contact with Gillian is due to another Christie biographer whose book on Christie is not yet out. That would be Lucy Worsley, whose book Agatha Christie, An Elusive Woman, is coming out later this year. I am so excited for that. And I just want to thank her for putting me in touch with Gillian, who really is such an important part of the biographical landscape of Christie. I mentioned Janet Morgan a lot on this podcast, whose 1984 biography of Christie is the first official one, and in some ways the standard from which all others deviate, just packed with information, such a crucial text. I mentioned Laura Thompson's 2007 biography, which I just think is so brilliant and has so many critical and readerly insights into it from someone who's just thought a lot about why Christie is as effective as she is. But Gillian was really doing a lot of that critical and readerly insight much earlier, just a few short years after Janet Morgan's book came out. And there are other biographies of Christie as well. And a few of them I mention from time to time. There are others I haven't even mentioned at all. And that is in no way meant to be a slight. There's just so much reference material out there when it comes to Christie. But I'm really glad that we are able to explore in this episode one of the books that has been neglected thus far on this podcast. And that is a wrong that is about to be righted in a few short seconds. Let's get to it. What a pleasure it is to welcome Gillian Gill onto the podcast today. Gillian is an academic who has taught at Northeastern University, Wellesley, Harvard, and Yale. And as a writer, she specializes in biography, starting with Agatha Christie, The Woman and Her Mysteries, which was published in 1990. She has also published biographies on Mary Baker Eddy, who was the founder of the Christian Science movement, in case you're not familiar with her. Florence Nightingale, I think most of you know who she is, Victoria and Albert, and most recently, Virginia Woolf. So I am really thrilled to have such a distinguished scholar on the program. Welcome, Gillian.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Kempa.
Probably the most striking thing about your wonderful biography of Agatha Christie, which I feel remiss for not having spoken about enough on the podcast up until now. It really is delightful. And I think the interesting thing that you do is that you're employing a different methodology in telling Christie's life story from a more usual biographical study. Because really your book is a critical study of Christie's work. And you look at 5 of her mysteries specifically, and 3 of her Mary Westmacott titles. And the insights that you're drawing from your analysis of those texts is your entry point into the world of Agatha Christie, which, as you note, is an extremely private world. I love that in particular because what I and my former co-host Catherine, have done for the past 5+ years now on this podcast is to study Christie by way of her work product, by reading her books closely and carefully. And I think that that's something that people haven't done enough of, although they're doing it a lot more, and they have been doing it a lot more in recent years. So again, I just want to note the year that this book was published. It was a while ago, not to make you feel too old, but it was 1990. Again, that is worth repeating, when almost no one else was, I think, treating Agatha Christie in this way. So I'm curious how this project came about exactly, how you came to write about Christie and how it affected your career as a biographer.
Well, it was the beginning. I mean, in every way. It was the beginning. Imagine a sort of 45-ish woman who's dropped out of academia, who's failed totally as a real estate broker, who's living in Paris, which is where, she has a PhD in literature. She speaks very good French, and yet she has nothing to do in France. She is, I think, in a clinical depression. And she sits down at her table, and this is actually true, and said, I'm going to say, what are my assets here and what could I possibly do? And I said, well, my assets are, I know about fiction. Okay, I've written my PhD on narrative technique, God help us. And I'm a feminist and I've done a lot on feminist theory. And so if I were to write a book, what could I possibly produce that would get published? Because now, okay. And I think to myself, well, who are the sort of group of the most popular women writers in the world, and I think are British women detective fiction writers. Mm-hmm. And here again, I'm a native Brit. I'm living in America, but and I've become American, but I am a native Brit. So again, this is sort of and I think immediately are P.D. James and Dorothy Sayers, because I know them, I love them. Mm-hmm. Gaudy Night was one of the most important books in my life. So, I think, P.D. James, but, I'm a scholar in the sense that I'm an academic. I think, well, before I do that, I should probably look at that boring old Agatha Christie, whom I have not read literally since I was a young teenager. Mm-hmm. When I read probably a few of the most famous books. But that's a long time ago. So I sit down with Christie, and this is where in a life you get a whoa moment. You think, I have something to say about this woman. Mm-hmm. I can say something about this because I bring to her what other people have not brought. And in fact, it turned into a book contract. However, at the beginning, this was meant to be a critical study because that was what I was good at, analyzing novels. I'm good at that. And thinking about women's lives. And can I add one other thing? This whole image of Christie as an older woman who, starts her career in her late 20s, essentially in the way that she gets published, right? 1919 is the first book contract she gets, right?
Correct.
And then becomes a sort of phenomenon in her 50s and keeps going. Well, to someone who is a 45-year-old failure, there is a model here that I'm not finding in so many other famous women writers, okay? This is not the woman who dies at 25. It's not the Bronte model, right? It's not the Mary Wollstonecraft model. It's the model of someone who keeps going, comes through, and has the strength to do a whole range of things later in life. Whoa, I think, yes, this is my kind of woman, even though she's not my kind of woman at all. So I started to read her books. And one of the things, the important thing too, that I read her books, a large number of her books before I read any criticism. And when I read the criticism, I'm thinking, these guys have got to be joking. They're saying that someone who sold by this time, I'm speaking now, 1987, 1988, mm-hmm. had already sold, what was it? Hundreds of millions?
Oh, I think copies? Probably a billion. I mean, I know it's over 2 billion now, but I had to be approaching a billion even at that point, right?
It was a lot, yeah. And you're saying to me that this woman had no literary skills, that she was a terrible writer? Really? And she keeps going. It's not just one set of books. I mean, one could say, 50 Shades of Grey, the vampire books, they were terribly written. They're great on movie or whatever you say. But it's sort of like a one-shot deal. Christie is not a one-shot deal. Mm-hmm. Right? She writes an absolutely extraordinary book out of the gun. After that, she produces masterpieces of the fiction of the genre that she's chosen for 40 years, 50 years. Whoa, this is a powerhouse. This is a powerhouse. And she reaches people all over the world in dozens of languages, right? She translates perfectly, even though her civilization is so archetypally British. Mm-hmm. What can, St. Mary Mead, what can that speak to someone in the Midwest, someone in the Far East, someone in China, someone in Japan. It did. It did. So something in this woman that plugs in to the international unconscious and speaks to the world. That is a talent that needs to be examined.
I love that. I don't think I've ever thought of that contrast, but that you do have that model, right, of those, the more romantic, almost Victorian or pre-Victorian model, like you said, of the bright spark that fizzles out, right? It's the genius, and they're young, and then they die for whatever reason, and they've written one or two things, and you're thinking, even Jane Austen. I mean, the older I get, I am now officially older than Jane Austen was when she passed away, which is just makes me feel terrible about my life a little bit. But you think to yourself, if Jane Austen had lived until she was 86, like Christie had, what would she have produced? So even she, I think, falls under that model. And Christie was not that. P.D. James actually wasn't that either, right? I mean, she was also a bit later.
No. But P.D. James is what? Almost 2 generations after.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Right. Yeah. It's
a different world when she comes in. And in fact, her world has been prepared by Sayers and Allingham and Josephine Tay and all.
And Christie. Yeah. No, 100%. I love that, the inspiration that you kind of were able to glean from Christie. And I mean, this is also the great thing about your book, because you do approach this question almost as a mystery. And I've always thought of it that way as well, that the ultimate mystery of Agatha Christie, it's not her 11-day disappearance, which you do absolutely discuss in your book, but it really is, why her? Why these books? Why is she so popular? Because the surface, superficial answer that people gave back in 1988 and that they still are giving now is because her plots are so brilliant. No, John Dixon Carr's plots are just as brilliant. They're and ingenious and clever. I could reel off 4 or 5 other names of people that were writing classic detective fiction in that time. And did they sell 2 billion books? Do people read them, on all 6 continents? I'm sure there are people in Antarctica reading Christie right now. Let's just say 7 continents. No, they didn't. So what is it about her? What did she do that, sort of gave her this access to all these readers' imaginations in her time and now? And she's only getting more popular too. I mean, as the years progress, that popularity is not waning. If anything, it feels like she's just constantly getting new fans. So I think you actually, you set about to answer that question. And I think you do in a lot of really interesting ways, some of which overlap with discussions that Catherine and I have had on this podcast and some that don't. So I just wanted to talk about 2 of them. And I'm really only going to cover 2, because if I talked about everything that you discuss in your book, I think this episode would be way too long. And I really do want to encourage people to check out your biography specifically, even if they've read, even if you've read Janet Morgan, who I really do quote, and you give her, the credit that I think she does deserve. I mean, that is it's the official biography. It's the first. It is such an invaluable reference. And there are so many other great biographies. Laura Thompson, has written a great biography.
I would have to say that Laura Thompson has written the greatest biography. I mean, I am just full of admiration for that book.
Absolutely.
Wish she, unfortunately, put me in her bibliography. That's the only thing I have against her. She doesn't mention me once. This is something of a beef.
that is, you know what, that is a rare misstep for Laura Thompson. But I think you really are doing something different in this, which is why, even if you've read those biographies, I think it is worth checking this one out. And I think you have some small answers as to how Christie sets herself apart and some big answers. And I want to do one small and one big with you and just kind of discuss them and tease them out a little bit. One of your small answers is that Christie, first you talk about how all mysteries are populated by material clues, right? Which are pieces of physical evidence. The cliched examples would be a cigarette ash or a stray glove, et cetera, et cetera.
Right,
we all know these objects.
Footsteps,
exactly.
Footprints.
And as readers, we have to settle for these clues being described to us. There is some sort of a narrator that stands between us and the clue, even if it's just a third person omniscient narrator. But there's a specific subset of these material clues, which in your book you call textual clues. And these are letters or fragments of notes or other bits of written
Bridge
evidence.
Scores. I mean, notably in Cards on the Table, the bridge score.
Bridge scores and cards on the table. Exactly. Something and anything that a reader can read, because the reader then can encounter and analyze those clues for him or herself. There is no narrative filter there. And I tend to call those close reading clues sometimes when you encounter them in Christie. There are some really clever ones in A Murder is Announced, for example. But
right. Yes.
I like your broader characterization of textual, because I think it's a larger umbrella, and there are a lot of them in Christie, and they start with The Mysterious Affair at Styles and they continue on through. There's actually a very bad example of a textual clue from The Clocks that comes to mind, which is a little too obvious. For example, she doesn't always do them perfectly, but she really does use a lot of these textual clues. And I'm just going to quote you for a second on the textual clue situation. You say, by the preference Christie displays for textual clues over material ones, she plays fairer with the reader than almost any other mystery writer. This is no doubt one of the reasons we still like her books. And I think you're absolutely right. I think, of course, there are other mystery writers that use textual clues, but Christie does it often. She does it consistently, and it's part of how fair she plays with her mysteries.
Yes. I mean, you referred to the fact that people have credited her with wonderful, complex plots. The locked room mystery would be the classic thing. How does one get murdered in a locked room? And all the different problems like that are complex. But she is fairer in the sense that she gives us, the essential clues are often the textual clues. And in that sense, we are able to say, oh, it was there. She showed it to me. I did not notice it, or I didn't give it fully. The detective does. At the end, I can see that I could, if I had been smarter, like Poirot or Miss Marple, have come up with this answer. Whereas when Sherlock Holmes looks at a hat and determines everything about the guy, we can't do that. Now, interestingly, if we go to the visual medium, which interestingly, Christie has been adapted to so brilliantly, we're back with visual clues. There, the textual clues are much less interesting. And this is where I would both critique and understand the recent Cards on the Table version, which totally subverts Christie's text. But bridge scores are not visually interesting, and you can't easily, but the expression on a face, the view of a room, all of those things can be visually conveyed. So, the adapters of Christie have to take a different tack. However, if we're just talking about the novels, there is a certain justice here. Now, could I also mention, because I think it's very, very important to Christie, the whole question of dialogue. Famously, she's thinking about writing her first novel. Her sister has challenged her. Her mother has encouraged her to go to Dartmoor, to a hotel, and walk the moors. And what does she do there? She talks to herself. She starts from dialogue. Now, again, dialogue is on the page. Yep. And here, the move into adaptation moves smoothly, right? We can go from the dialogue on the page. And here again, people say things in the dialogue. We look at it. We can read it. We can think about it. We can apply it. And we always come up with the wrong answer.
Right.
And that's why we say, oh my gosh, Mrs. Christie is extraordinary. But it is there. The way she tailors that, and might I say, now, because I am a biographer, I have become, thanks to my Christie book, I became a biographer rather than literary critic. This whole question of Christie being a person who's famously, in person, silent and inarticulate, refusing to give interviews, never saying anything in interviews that was even vaguely interesting. All of this inarticulateness starts at a very, very early age. And so we have, in Christie's autobiography, her remembering that at about the age of 3. Now, at 3, most of us are still pretty inarticulate, I would say. But Christie's making up stories about her kittens. She's a little 3-year-old girl, and she's saying them. It's a dialogue with the kittens already. So the dialogues are happening in her head.
Right.
They're not happening in real life. There's that juxtaposition of what you're saying in your head and what you're saying in real life. And then, of course, this whole question of how can you tell a person from the outside? And so you have this girl who is sociable, wonderful, articulate, musical, a whole lot of fun, loving to swim, playing tennis, terrible at golf, willing to have a go. I mean, really the ideal friend whom no one knows. No, who confides in no one and has this sense from a very, very early age that you cannot tell what a person is like, what a person is thinking, what a person intends by observing them from the outside. And that is the clue, I think, to her saying anyone can be a murderer. If you think of the Christie Earl, right? Beautiful. I mean, back to cards on the table.
Future Kemper here for a second, just intruding upon this interview as I'm editing it. The comment Gillian is about to make on Cards on the Table is not actually a spoiler, since the establishing concept of that novel, as many of you will know, is that four murderers, four people who have murdered in the past, are brought together for a game of bridge. And then in the course of that game, one of them then murders their host, Mr. Shaitana, who brought them together. So when Gillian is referring to this young woman who is a murderer, she is referring to the past murder. Perhaps that young woman is the one who committed the murder in the course of the bridge game, but perhaps not. If you haven't read it, you definitely should. All right, back to the interview.
You know, this charming little English woman who seems so sweet and is in fact a cold-blooded murderer. She doesn't look the part.
Right.
And the victim in that book is Mr. Shaitana, who looks absolutely the villain.
Right.
He is the archetypal villain.
Right.
Well, Christie's saying that's performance. What's happening inside? Anne is performing English virginity, sweet, English rose. And in the end, the only person whom can know a person is in Christie's cosmology now, God.
Right. Yeah, it's true. I mean, well, and I was struck because I'm getting this from your book when you mention the fact that even at that young age of 3, when Christie was telling stories about the kittens in her nursery and saying them aloud, she realized that her nurse was overhearing her, and she was so shocked and horrified by that. It almost felt like a betrayal of confidence, right? That oh my God, she can hear what I'm saying, and even then she was kind of receded into herself, right? And she wanted that to be private.
My kittens are mine, no one but mine. And from now on, the good dialogues are going to be in my head, or of course they're on the page and they're sent out to you and me to read. And this is where, when I look back on my book, what I think is that the way to Christie, the honorable way, is through her books, because that's the way she wanted to be. What she wanted us to know about her life, she puts out for those who are interested. Come tell me how you live. The memoir that she wrote about her experiences on the digs in Iraq and Syria, which is a most delightful book, incidentally. I do recommend it. She will give forth what she wants to give forth. She'll write an autobiography, which will be published after her death, in order to cut the feet under of all those who would write biographies for her. This is a controlling woman, and who manipulates the public and private through the means of her printed text. So in a way, I'm talking about textual clues. The books are textual clues writ large.
They really are. And it's funny, you absolutely make that point about her autobiography and in your biography. And I think it's even more apparent when one reads Come Tell Me How You Live. Catherine and I actually covered that once for a special episode. And what we finally realized, my revelation was that book is like one long book length holiday letter. Like, those breezy letters that people write to each other at the holidays, where they're technically conveying information. They're conveying facts about their family, but they're really not telling you anything that they don't want you to know. It's very performative. It's very surface. Yes. It's not superficial necessarily, but it's telling one aspect of who you are and leaving a lot unsaid. And that's what that book feels like. Oh, what a lark. We're off to the Middle East and here is how our lives were. And then she'll give specific, and it is delightful because she is such a charming and diverting writer. We see that in her novels. And it's why the autobiography, by the way, if pushed, I say that the autobiography might be my favorite Christie, because it's just such fun. It's such fun to read, right? You just love her. You're like, I wish I could have met this person in life. And, right? Yes. She's so vibrant. Yes. But she is controlling that narrative. Yeah. I mean, she's telling you what she wants to tell you and not telling you what she doesn't want to tell you. And I will get back to, let's just be organic with the conversation. I will get back to the other big reason why Christie sets herself apart from other writers. But you're bringing up the point of Christie leaving textual clues as to who she really is in her books. And you talk a great deal in your biography about the Mary Westmacott titles. Yes. So I did want to ask you about those, because we don't talk about them enough, actually, on the regular podcast. We have a Patreon offshoot where I've covered 2 out of the 6 Mary Westmacott titles thus far. So I've covered Unfinished Portrait and The Rose and the Yew Tree. And those are actually 2 of the Mary Westmacotts you talk the most about in your biography. Yes. You also spend a lot of time on Giant's Bread, which was her first, the first Mary Westmacott. And just in case anyone is not aware, I mean, these are the novels that Christie wrote under the pseudonym Mary Westmacott. They are called romance novels. They are not romance novels. No. And you just have to read them to know that they are not romance novels. That will become very obvious to you. And you posit that the Westmacott titles are the key to Christie's interior life. And especially after reading Unfinished Portrait, I completely agree, because reading that side by side with the autobiography, you can see that she's, lifting whole scenes, but then giving them emotional coloring and actually giving you a glimpse of what it actually felt like in a way that she doesn't necessarily do in the autobiography. So, I mean, I'm curious, if you had to recommend just one Westmacott title for a Christie diehard, say for someone listening to this podcast, which one you would recommend and why?
I think anyone who has come to Christie because of the 11-day disappearance, has to be Unfinished Portrait. Interesting in Christie because, let's think about this name, Agatha Christie. Christie is the name of her husband, right? Her first husband, who basically was a rat, who betrayed her and who caused her the greatest distress of her life. And she keeps the name because, as she says in one book, if you want to marry a man, you should marry him, even if you regret it. So in this book, we have, first of all, Mary Westmacott fiercely defended anonymity, right? No connection with Agatha Christie. Complex arrangements with publishers. The connection with her is not. The name itself, the way that it uses, Agatha, Mary, Clarissa, Miller, Christie, Malawan, right? This is her total set of names. Dame Agatha, Lady Malawan, to give her titles as well. Okay, complex person. Anyway, she is using what I call, in the way that detective fiction is the part of her mind that A, earns money for her, B, allows her to express, to adopt certain masks. A very complex relationship with Fig, but then it's a mask, unlike Sayers, unlike even James to some extent, certainly unlike Tay. She's not revealing herself in. She wants to do this since text is her major way of dealing with people at a distance, not needing to confide. So she needs the Westmacott. They are, if you were going to look at the therapy of Christie, the Westmacotts are the way she keeps sane in a certain way. And so Westmacotts are so important. And in Unfinished Portrait, you get the dialogues with Archie. Now, of course, this is a master. I hate to use the word master, but someone who's supremely good at fictional dialogue. This is Agatha Christie, right? Who pushes her narrative forward on the basis of dialogue. So we have the dialogue in this book where you see someone, and this is so relevant today, gaslighting, right? A woman who is being pushed to the edge, a rational, practical, achieving, active woman whose husband has told her that he does not love her and wants to marry someone else. And she resists him. And what does he do? He pushes her psychologically over and over again. And you get that. And this woman is pushed to looking at the the rat poison in the shed,
Right.
who tries to commit suicide. She is telling us as dramatically as she can how it could happen that Agatha Christie in real life should have had what I truly regard was an hysterical fugue for 11 days. She dramatizes that. Now, can we really believe that Archie Christie in real life said this, couldn't you? Well, in a way, actually, I do, because this is a master of dialogue.
Yeah.
This is someone who specializes in this. And when he says things to her or looks at her in certain ways, those are imprinted on her extremely brilliant brain, her excellent memory, and she reproduces it. So I do think that's the key to that episode. Now, another interesting, Giant's Bread is a very interesting book, if only because of, Christie the musician. Christie referred to herself as a lowbrow. This is one up for the lowbrow, she says when she gets the award. What are we talking about here? This is a woman who collected sculpture, who was into Wagner in Britain when Wagner was not exactly popular, who's into, who's asking in her 80th year for copies of Franz Fanon and Hermit Marcuse. This is a woman of extraordinary modern sensibilities. She's just not educated. She's kept out of education. She never goes to college. She never goes to school. So she has this chip on her shoulder about being, and then is told in childhood that she is stupid. My God, this is a biography we could all relate to as women. Isn't this sort of almost the archetypal biography we want to? And who conquers all of these challenges in her life so supremely and produces a body of work which we can love now. Whoa.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I really love that you don't dismiss the Westmacott titles because they're not, I don't think they're all necessarily created.
It's not great fiction.
No.
But it's very interesting fiction.
It's interesting fiction.
We all have, book clubs, and there's the book club meeting where everybody loves the book, right? I love that book. Oh, love that scene. That character. It's a dead session, What you're looking for is a interesting book. And The Rose of the Yew Tree, that's an interesting book. The fact that it was published before T.S. Eliot wrote The Cocktail Party is very interesting to me because it delves into the same issues. I've been reading a lot of Muriel Spark recently, The Girls of Slender Means. These are deeply religious writers, okay? Muriel Spark as a Catholic, Agatha Christie is sort of a high Anglican, however you would see it. This whole idea of the imitation of Christ, giving one's life in order that another person in the real world may become a great missionary or something like that, where the experience, notably a man, is changed by the sacrifice of the woman. And this goes through so much of the Westmacott fiction, but also of course, in the novels. But it's much more hidden there. But again, if you think about the novels, the times when someone interposes themselves, here I would mention to those of you who are sort of looking for the unknown Christie, the Parker Pine, Mr. Satterthwaite, Harley Quinn stories. Again, you get much more of the what you would call the theological or spiritual.
Spiritual. We've covered all of them, especially the Quinn Satterthwaite. You really get a sense of her spirituality, religiosity, even really. They truly, especially toward the end, get religious in almost like a C.S. Lewis kind of a way.
Yes. Or T.S. Eliot.
Yeah. And that book, definitely The Rose and the Yew Tree. It didn't, not in its religious themes, but for some reason, it reminded me of Somerset Maugham also as I was reading.
Oh, really? I don't know Maugham well, so I can't comment on that.
But it is literary, and it is interesting, as you say. They're not the best literary fiction you're going to come across, but there's a lot to chew on in those books. It's absolutely true, and I think they would make good book club fodder in that way. And then especially for anyone who's just fascinated by Christie, the person, it's essential. Those books are just essential. So I just love giving those books their due because I think for real Christie fans, they're not to be overlooked. One of the other, so this is one of your big reasons as to why Christie sets herself apart from her contemporaries. And I love this because it really taught me something actually as I was reading your book. I'm just going to quote from you here. It is no accident that Christie never lost her childhood fascination with fairy stories, and that fairy tale themes ring out so insistently in her work. 10 Little Indians, 1, 2, Buckle My Shoe, Crooked House, Hickory Dickory Dock, 5 Little Pigs, A Pocket Full of Rye, 3 Blind Mice, Cat Among the Pigeons. How many of Agatha Christie's titles recall the world of childhood fairy tales, the world of Mother Goose and the Brothers Grimm? The fairy tale world is today recognized as a vital expression of the collective unconscious, revealing a special kind of archetypal truth. Christie's writing has the sparseness, the directness, the narrative pace, and the universal appeal of the fairy story. And it is perhaps as modern fairy stories for grown-up children that Christie's novels succeed. And it's funny because in the last interview that I did, it was with the psychological thriller writer Alex Michaelides. I don't know if you've read any of his work, but we were making this exact point, and I had brought up the idea that I think it was Robert Barnard, but someone had once compared Christie's writing to just myth making and sort of its directness of mythology in the same way, and why that could be a reason for its universal appeal. And Alex is the one who brought up fairy tales and the idea of fairy stories, which he said for him was an analogy that worked better. And I think I've always personally hated or disliked, maybe hate is too strong a word, disliked the fairy tale stuff in Christie. I don't like the way that she uses fairy tales for titles sometimes. I think that 5 Little Pigs, which by the way, we have ranked in our, overarching ranking project that we've done on this podcast, it's ranked as the #1 title. Really? I think the 5 Little Pigs business mars it slightly, like makes it seem a little sillier than it might otherwise. But I think that's a prejudice of mine that I officially need to get over, because I take your point 100%. I think that, as is always the case with Christie, she's not doing anything by accident. And I don't think that it's a coincidence that she is referencing fairy tales and fairy stories as much as she does, and nursery rhymes in these books. It's not something to sneer at. I think it kind of goes hand in hand with the writing that she's doing, and perhaps the reason why there's this universal appeal, in the same way that fairy tales have that appeal. And fairy tales are almost authorless, right? I mean, most people don't, we think of the Brothers Grimm. The Brothers Grimm collected those fairy tales, right? They didn't write them. Yeah. So, and that's kind of that's Agatha Christie's dream. That's what she was trying to do, right? I mean, she was receiving as much from the story as she could. So it's almost as if she created these fairy tales, as you're saying. So why not use, nursery rhymes and fairy tale titles for her stories? It makes perfect sense.
And, one thing, you're young and you're originally American, I take it.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
I'm old and British in origin. Fairy tales and nursery rhymes were the absolutely solid part of our culture. Yeah. I mean, I can still tell you those stories, recite those rhymes to you. They're sort of ground in. And now, as I come along in life, I've never really followed this up, but there is now a real understanding that fairy tales, folk tales, whatever you call it, there are themes that go throughout the world, that in Japan, in, of course, the Arabian cultures, there are these stories that are universal. These plots are universal. These characters, the speaking cat, that these are universal themes. And so if someone is plugging that into her apparently modern day detective fiction thing, that is a powerful tool of hers. And then when we get from fairy tale to myth, where the border is not that strong, right? When you come to a book like Nemesis, right, where we have a very clear idea of Miss Marple as Nemesis Adrastea, the goddess of revenge, of vengeance, and then the 3 Atropos, the Moirai, the Fates in the book. She is doing mythology there. She's sort of, and late in life. I mean, this is sort of so interesting to me. And of course, it's partly in relation to her husband, who is this great, well-known archaeologist, plugging into the whole ancient Eastern ideas. And of course, her Egyptian book, which you probably, I don't think it's very good either, but, her ancient Egyptian book is not very good. But it's interesting that she's trying it, to try and, have. And again, when we think about so much of modern detective fiction, people are doing exactly that. Medieval monks. That is Japanese. That's again, she's doing something that has been radically explored since.
No, that's true. And, that book has its passionate defenders. Death Comes as the End. That is one of the most controversial rankings that we've done, because we have it ranked very low. I do not like it at all. But
no.
It's a historical fiction, right? I actually happened to be speaking about that with Alex Michaelides as well, because that was one of his points he wanted to make, which is that we had ranked that very novel too low. And he said, maybe you're just not as a big enough fan of historical fiction. And I'll be honest, I'm not. I haven't read it enough. So maybe I don't have enough of an appreciation for what she did, especially as one of the originators, certainly of historical fiction, put into a mystery setting. That really was an innovation and something that you do have to give her points for trying, if not for the execution of the mystery.
Well, that's right. That's right.
Have you ever brushed your teeth only to find moments later your breath is, well, not so fresh? Odds are this is because you have an imbalance of good and bad bacteria in your mouth. When we brush our teeth, we're killing both the good and bad bacteria, and from there, it's a race to see which can repopulate faster. For most, the bad bacteria always win. Give your breath a fighting chance with CariPro Dental Probiotics. Every time you brush your teeth and tongue, park a probiotic in your mouth and let it dissolve over time. Repeat this process for 30 days and your army of good bacteria should consistently outnumber the bad. If that's not enough to convince you dental probiotics are a must-have, you should know that good bacteria fights off plaque, tooth decay, and builds immune defenses. For a limited time, use promo code AGATHA, AGATHA, for 20% off Smile Brilliant's CariPro Dental Probiotics and their suite of dentist-grade oral care products. So visit www.smilebrilliant.com and use promo code AGATHA today.
I think one part of my book that we haven't covered is her treatment of women and her female characters. And I come to this because one of the critics that I did read when I was starting on Christie, I won't mention her name, but she absolutely loathes Christie. Christie was not a suffragette. She was not, I mean, she could have been, right? She's born in 1890. Mm-hmm. So she could have been, Mm-hmm. She was never a feminist. She never signed up for anything. She was strictly apolitical. She didn't support any female causes. She was a lifelong, as far as she voted, Tory, conservative. Mm-hmm. This person really excoriated her and said, it's almost a disgrace that the most read female author in the world is this inarticulate, sort of dim, old fuddy-duddy, old-fashioned, mm-hmm. conventional thinking, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
Well, I'm looking at the women in Christie. And at one point in my book, I actually read sections of my book. I have this one section where I say, and the male characters stand around looking decorative. Well, that is sort of a lot of the early Christie. You have this extreme version, which comes again out of, we talked about the rose and the yew tree, the strange character, Isabella, that we never get inside. She is this absolutely brilliant mathematician. She is Christie in a way. Tall, beautiful, impenetrable, and totally in touch with the physical world. All right. The women in Christie are new women as defined circa 1910. Mm-hmm. That is to say that they are out in the world, they're out to make money, they are smart in both senses, fashion-oriented, quick on the draw, driving their cars fast, way ahead of their men, and often willing to murder in order to satisfy the desire they have for a particular man whose needs, material needs, are great. And therefore, she has to plot to murder someone so that she and her lover can be rich, because he needs to be rich, because he is this beautiful, decorative, idle, useless man. That is a radical view of male-female relationships.
It absolutely is. And I want to make the point, I'm going to quote from you too in your book, because I think that a lot of listeners might automatically just start thinking of her young pert heroines, who she definitely does create. You know, she has her Tuppence Beresford, nay Cowley, yes. Right? And then Emily Trefusis and Bundle Brent and yes, Chimneys yes. and Seven Dials. And those characters are great, but some of the really powerful women really are the murderers. And I had not realized this before, but this is a really great fact that you bring up, and I believe you discovered in your book. This is what you write. In the 15 Christie novels in which murder is committed by a man-woman team, it is interesting to notice that either the male or the female conspirator can come from a lower social class. Either the man or the woman can be the elder. The wealth the conspirators seek to appropriate can be held by either a patriarch or a matriarch. The actual act of murder can be committed by either partner, but the brains and energy behind the murder plot are usually supplied by the female partner, whereas the charm and good looks are more commonly the males. And it's absolutely true. I think that's such a good point. That is usually the way that those male-female pairs work out in a Christie novel, that the woman, maybe they were both the brains, but the woman is always part of the brains. And it really often is because the man needed the money to be happy, and she wanted him to be happy because his happiness was dependent on her happiness. And from there, the chips fell and murder happened. And that's really interesting.
Yes, it is.
That she did that. So you did touch on Christie's political views, or lack thereof, I might add as a parenthetical, because it's striking to me that in a lot of the Christie thrillers in which politics come up, and this is one of those areas where I think it's one of the rare times when perhaps Christie's personality does come through a little bit on the page, we get this notion over and over again of the status quo being the best option, because revolutionary ideas, they can either be naive or malicious, but they're almost always dangerous, or bad things happen, either intended or unintended, from revolutionary ideology. We really see that. We see that in The Secret Adversary, which she wrote when she was about 30. And you see that all the way through to Passenger to Frankfurt, which she wrote when she was pushing 80, right? So to me, it's just curious that sort of stance, that political stance, never changed. And I'm inclined to say that perhaps that's disappointing, or it means that she just wasn't really engaging with the politics of her day. And she just had such a distaste for it that she wanted things to stay the same because she didn't really want to deal with it. But maybe I'm thinking about that in totally the wrong way. And you're obviously someone who's thought a lot about these kinds of matters. So I'm curious how you approach those political thrillers and just Christie's political ideology through the decades.
I have to say, what you might call her thrillers are the part that I think are most derivative of male culture. The sort of Edgar Wallace, John Buchan-ish, and those sold very well. She didn't need to think about them. And I think, therefore, for me, they're very uninteresting. I think the counterpart between her existing in this almost indirect touch with the sensual world, in touch with God as a religious, a believer on a deep level, the Imitation of Christ on her bedside that she reads each night. Suchet, by the way, gets this very, very well, the religious dimension. So that means that she is radically detached. And that detachment is also profoundly contemptuous, I would say. Think of the George Lomax type character. And above all, now this is unfortunately me reaching back and not remembering the novel, but there is one novel where a powerful politician has murdered someone. And he says, well, I am in a position, and I think this is shortly before World War II, the world is gearing up for a second, having gone through World War I. He says, I'm in a position, I killed this person because I am important. My life is important. And Poirot, who is the voice of Christie in a certain way, says, I am interested in the life of single people. I do not believe that ideologies are the answer. And she says to the young revolutionary in that novel something like, go forward, be just and be kind. Just and kind. Now that's a very primitive form of politics, but actually I think it's not. I think it's not shallow. Um,
Right.
and certainly the pompousness, the self-importance, the I am the Lord of the world thing did not go down well with Christie. And that's why, let's say, she detaches herself from it. I'm not defending her lack of, and I do think, look at the Rose of the Yew Tree, that 1946 election that she is the sort of center of the beginning of the book.
Yeah.
It was a very key election. Christie understood that. This is when Winston Churchill and the Conservative Party, well, Winston Churchill as the leader of the Tory party, is being thrown out and is fighting back. And that whole picture of the candidate of the lower class who has this what Christie calls the flat accent here. This will Virginia Woolf will be saying this over and over again. People with the wrong accents. Mm-hmm. He's got the wrong accent. What has he got? He was in the war. He won the Victoria Cross, which is the ultimate bravery thing.
Right.
And he is ambitious and he is going to go for it. And he ultimately becomes a saint in the book, right?
Yep.
That's an interesting point of view. And as I say, Christie's got it. Because she's in touch with the Conservative Party types, this is sort of when she and Max are in England, maybe these are the type of guys that they're sort of running around with at their party. I mean, she knows this type and she doesn't like them. And she thinks they're defunct and she knows there has to be, as it were, a lower class conservatism. God, we're going to get Thatcher, we're going to get... That's going to come forward. She's prophetic in that respect.
I think that's a good point, that the Rose and the Yew Tree might be her best political novel, actually. Yes. And that is a novel where she is engaging with a specific political moment and she has she has full understanding of it. And it's such an important one. I mean, because that's the Clement Attlee, right? I mean, it's kind of a fulcrum point almost in British politics. And I didn't even have that much of an understanding of it. I had to look into it while I was reading The Rose and the Yew Tree, but she helped me understand it. So I think that in a way is a little bit almost of an antidote to the detachment or disengagement that you get in the quote unquote political thrillers, where perhaps she's being overwhelmed by having to write this derivative story within a more male tradition, which was not the case when she was writing her mysteries. And
a more male British interwar male tradition, which was very, looking back to the colonial past, all of these sort of strong silent types, these tanned explorers of the jungle with Colonel this and Major that, all of those figures, some of whom are good and some of whom are bad and some of whom are detectives and some of whom are not. I think, everybody has the faults that correspond to their virtues, and that's true of Christie. Remember all the young revolutionaries she has in her books? Mm-hmm. They're never the murderers.
It's true. They're never the murderers, but they're never very smart either. They're always misguided. True. They're always misguided. And when she says
that this is not entirely false, that, young aristocratic public school guys go through a period of left-wing socialist. Yep. That is true. And it's a phase. And it was. That's not, she wasn't wrong there. And as I say, she doesn't have, these guys are always, he's a revolutionary, Well, he is, but he actually doesn't throw any bombs. Right. And again, her view that ideologies are, the people who are ideologues are the ones you have to look out for. That's, we're dealing with it now, right? People who have an ideology that they will carry, those are the ones you have to look out for. It's
about cynicism, right? Which is, and I'll quote you again, because it's sort of the flip side. I mean, I think that this is a point that you make. Cynicism is one of the other reasons why Christie in particular is so powerful and I think has such a universal appeal. You write that cynicism is at the heart of her delight in upsetting the reader's preconceptions and in confounding established scenarios. It is this originality that has made her as interesting to the American teenager in the late 80s as she was to the retired British Army colonel of the 20s. And that's the same cynicism that she felt toward, I'm still quoting from you, organized politics and political ideology of all kinds. So it's almost like the flip side, which I've never thought about it in quite that way, but there's power in that cynicism. And especially, I always say the Miss Marple novels are so driven by cynicism. That's Miss Marple's power. She's never going to be taken in by an ideologue, right? Big or small. Miss Marple is feet firmly on the ground. She knows what's up, right? And that cynicism is her power. And in a way, it's the power of the Christie mysteries. And I think we can all appreciate that. But when that's applied toward politics overall, sometimes it can be a little bit limiting, perhaps. And again, that was just her stance. And I think it's, again, she's someone who was writing over 50 years. So I'm just noting as I'm doing this chronological review that stance didn't change. But you know what? That's who she was. So that's who she was.
And she moved in very limited circles. I mean, they were internationally interesting because there's the whole, with Malawan, the whole Iraqi-Syrian thing going on.
Absolutely. And her tour around the world, right? Even with Archie Christie.
Well, yes.
This is a well-traveled person.
In Hawaii. And, that's an extraordinary story in itself. And whatever she was brave. I mean, in the war, she stays in the center of London and works in a dispensary 2 days a week and writes novels. How many novels does she write during the Second World War? I mean, a lot, right?
A lot, like 10 or something?
Yes.
I think around 10.
And keep some of them in the bank, for the future and all that kind of stuff. I mean, really an extraordinary person, not cowed physically. Oh, and before we go, one thing I got to say, she's funny. Agatha Christie is funny. And she, unlike so many of the other great Golden Age people, laughs at herself. And can we finally end up with Ariadne Oliver? Because what's her name? Zoe Wanamaker? She is marvelous. She is totally marvelous. And Agatha and her ridiculous detective, Sven Holmgren or whatever his name is.
Sven Hiersten, who has his own series now. You know that they have adapted Sven Hiersten. Yes. Agatha Christie's fictional writer's fictional detective now has a series one season of which has been produced.
And, she says she's the author of The Case of the Second Goldfish. Well, that's where Christie, the famous article where Raymond Chandler says, we can't take any of this Golden Age British fiction. I mean, the Amazonian blow dart and, this isn't how people are actually killed. They're not killed in sophisticated music. They're killed in mean streets, and you have this tall, lone man who walks through proud, who's the hero of Dashiell Hammett and episode stuff. Well, it's true. Poirot is not like that. Marple is not like that. She was able to see it, to satirize it, to parody herself. I mean, Ariadne Oliver is herself in a way, the apple cores, the messiness. I mean, she is marvelous. And one last thing, Christie famously says, I hate to think. I like to have lots of time doing nothing. The important thing for women, this is a message we all get. Leisure time is not wasted time. It is time for creativity. Mm-hmm. When you aren't busy doing the housework, keeping the nappies clean. I mean, not that nappies are clean anymore, but, whitening the laundry. I'm sorry, that was me really going back a bit. Making sure the countertops are immaculate, organizing, going to meetings, blah, blah, blah. What are you not doing? You're not sitting with yourself, thinking creatively and producing something. And women need to do that. And she did. And at one point I make, because I wrote about Agatha Christie and Virginia Woolf. Virginia Woolf said you had to have a room of your own. But Agatha Christie said, hey, I didn't need a room of my own because I had houses of my own.
Yeah, she actually had houses.
I paid for every one of them.
Every single one of them. Oh, I mean, and she basically paid for Max Mallowan's books, the archaeological tomes. Yes, I feel like that he wrote.
Financed that.
She just financed it because it was, let's just say it wasn't a bestseller, in the same way that her books were. Well, I do want to end also just on giving listeners a sense of the 5 books that you really analyze in granular detail in your book, because this is also just really interesting. What you do is you spoil those 5 books in the course of the critical study / biography, you spoil thoroughly because you really deep dive into what makes those books tick. And so the books are The Mysterious Affair at Styles, The Secret of Chimneys, Cards on the Table, The Body in the Library, and Nemesis. And then that is all that you spoil. You do not spoil any other titles. So I thought that was really interesting. And I have to ask you, because The Secret of Chimneys in particular is notorious on this podcast. It is our bottom ranked novel. I do realize there is a lot of humor in it, but a lot of it has to do with the issue of what we call depictions stuck in their time. And you deal with this in the book, especially the anti-Semitic portrayal of the Herman Isaacstein character is just very hard to read. But I'm curious why you chose those 5 books and just how you came to structure your biography the way you did, because it's such a unique text.
One thing, I wrote a critical study, and then, I sent in a complete manuscript to my editor, who's wonderful, Joyce Seltzer, who was then at Macmillan at Free Press. And she said, Gillian, this was not going to, you have to turn this whole thing into a biography.
Oh, so you hadn't written a biography at all. You truly had written a critical study of... No,
I hadn't.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I have to say, I went through Christie's book and I analyzed every book. And I wish I had those notes and I have lost them.
I do,
because
too.
I have a complete breakdown, who does what the plot is.
Of every book? Like all 66?
Not the short stories, but all the novels. Yeah, I did that.
Wow.
I was very diligent. I am a diligent, typical woman, diligent, boring, diligent. Anyway, so I am thrown for a loop because one of the interesting things about Christie is that her papers are not in the public domain. Here, I'm going to speak to you as a biographer. If you want the papers of Dorothy Sayers, they're out there. You can go and see them. Christie's are all still, as I understand it, and you could contradict me here because I am not up on this, only 2 people have been allowed complete access to the extraordinary collection of stuff on Christie. So Christie was a locked box, all right? Mm-hmm. So what do? I say, okay, we'll proceed according to modern critical theory, basically. So I'm going to talk about names, Agatha, as I said, Agatha, Mary, Clarissa, Amilla, Christie, Malawan, Dame Agatha. Mm-hmm. And then we have in the Mary Westcott, that's another alias, so I take that. And then, when in her disappearance, she enrolls herself at the Harrogate Spa Hotel as Neil, right?
Teresa Neil. Mm-hmm.
Teresa Neil. Mm-hmm. Neil being the name of her husband's about-to-be second wife, but not mistress, according to him. So these names, so I take these names, these are my chapter headings, and I just read her autobiography. I read her Come Tell What You Lived. I find out what I can. Mm-hmm. I read, at that point, there was only one authorized biography. I read that into the ground. I spatter this little shaking of biographical detail around my book. And then I do what I sort of wanted to do all the time, and which, as I said at one point in this interview, I honor myself for doing, because that's the way that Christie would have wanted it. She told us what she wanted us to know. At that time, for example, when I wrote the book, it's published in 1990, information about Malawan's relationship with his second wife, and Christie's last years. I didn't go anywhere near that. I didn't have any information about it. Yep. And even the disappearance, I read everything I could read about it. And then I put my own interpretation on it based on the extensive work I'd done on hysteria in previous years. So, I didn't really write a biography. I wrote a critical study. And I tried to stretch across the breadth of her work. I mean, I didn't even touch the short stories, as you can see. Mm-hmm. I mentioned Harley Quinn a few times, but basically, I'm trying to show the range of her books. And in the case of the first book, The Mysterious Affair at Styles, I really, really dig into that as someone who considers herself an expert on narrative technique. Mm-hmm. Because that's where you can see the nuts and bolts. And those nuts and bolts will be used throughout the Christie era. And with that in place, you can do any novel.
Yeah.
And the way that Christie fits in, not just into the detective fiction of Anna, the Leavenworth affair, whatever her name, Anna something Green, Gaston Leroux,
Anna Catherine Green, yeah.
Edgar Allan Poe, how she fits into that, but also how she fits into general fictional, notably Henry James. Henry James was actually a guest at her home when she was a child. Her father was part of the American diaspora in Europe, as was Henry James. So that link with Henry James, which I happen to be able to make because I am a passionate devotee of Henry James, I was able to see how she fitted into that. And so I applied my literary culture to Agatha Christie, knowing that she had it. I'm not good on Shakespeare. I think anyone who's good on Shakespeare, we've talked about myths, we've talked about fairy tales. We haven't really got into Shakespeare. It's another huge, huge thing with her, especially, we haven't even talked about her drama. I never go into her plays. Whoa, what a dramatist, And
what a successful drama. Again, the popular success of her plays is rivaled by almost no one, similar to her books.
That's right. But above all, I just plugged in what I knew. And my feminist theory, about how women react to things like losing their beauty. That spoke to me loud and clear. This apparently very, very beautiful woman, extremely attractive to men, very passionate, someone for whom physical sex is simply so obvious and wonderful that you don't even talk about it. This is one of the weird things. Again, a paradoxical, we've had the speech, no speech. Here we have, there's no sex in Christie. There's not a single sex scene. Now they've put them into they've supplied them. But they're not there. But in a way, that's because, well, yes, that's what you do. You're passionately in love with them. Why would we even talk about that?
Why do we even need? Yeah. Well, and through Miss Marple, she makes that point time and again of, it's not that we didn't talk about sex. We just didn't, we weren't obsessed by it in the same way and tortured by it and have such a tortured relationship with it as
and
people
perhaps had a lot more and enjoyed it more.
Enjoyed it. And you can tell, when you truly do a close reading of a book like Five Little Pigs, there's a lot of sex going on in that house.
Oh, yes.
A ton of sex, and not just between a man and his mistress, between a man and his wife, and also a man and his mistress. And it's very obvious that there's a lot of physical sex happening there. And no, she doesn't need to depict it on the page. Why does she have to do that? She's not interested in doing that. But that doesn't translate into not being interested in sex. It is very obvious that she was quite interested in it as a person.
There's God and then there's passion. And she sees, I think rather wonderfully, sex is something God gives you. Or not precisely. She says desire. Desire is God-given. It's a gift from God. It's a gift from God.
Right.
And here I compare her with Muriel Spark very much. Women who are devoutly religious, Christian, I should say Christian, devoutly Christian, right? Who see lust and adultery and promiscuity as trivial in a way. They're not what's important in the world. That's not it. Women and men are bodies and they absolutely go for one another. And that's one of the great pleasures of life. And that's why people do things. And that's true.
Right.
It's true. There's the love of money and there's the love of Joe or love of Gill.
No, I think it's so interesting. I love what you said, that you wrote a biography probably the way that Christie would. I'm sure she wouldn't want anyone to write a biography about her, but if she did, it would be this way, which is, okay, well, read what I put out there and then do your own thinking about it. And you really are acting as a literary detective in a way, and you are, figuring out. And I think, as someone who's chosen to steep himself in everything about Christie, both primary and secondary, for years now, I think what you come up with is a really accurate picture of who, again, what do I know, obviously, but for me, it felt insightful and accurate and interesting, and coming at it, I think, after, some of the authorized biographies that are based on that trove of information that's not available. I think it's just really, really helpful to have this sort of a biography alongside those for the specific insights that you're drawing, not only about her writing, which is important enough, but also about who she is as a person. Really, really interesting.
To relate to the disappearance, because when I was, as it were, in the promotion of my book back in the early 1990s, always got asked about the disappearance. I mean, there were movies about it, the movie Agatha, not that far back. I gave in my book, simply based on the texts, my somewhat Freudian and grounded in the history of hysteria and interpretation. And then, as you recall, and you can give me the dates on this, comes out this book and this program on British TV, ITV, I believe, saying, oh no, it was all conscious. It was totally, she had planned the whole thing, and she did it with her friend, and this is why she had the money. And it was absolutely a way of getting back at Archie and Nancy Neal. And I thought, damn, well, I got it wrong. What can I say? Totally blew it. I misinterpreted the whole thing. She put it over on me. She gave me the Agatha Christie deceived me.
She gave you the slip.
Sad about that. Then it goes along, and the next great biography comes out with something very similar to where I was, and says,
absolutely,
no, that whole thing was incorrect. And now there's this whole different chain of much more belief, but always coming back to what I did say, that in Unfinished Portrait, you're shown a woman who is driven into madness by psychological abuse and, trauma. And again, the loss of the mother. This was so trivialized in the past. This is no longer considered to be trivial. A woman's relationship with her mother is no longer considered to be of no importance. It's considered to be, I think, because of the whole development of women's studies, or whatever you call it, the relationship between her mother, both close and fiercely competitive and fiercely hostile in many, that complex, Christie's relationship with her mother becomes of intense interest. And the fact that her husband chooses to announce his apparently out of the blue to her decision to divorce her, request for divorce in order to marry this other woman, is in her house, her mother's home in Ashley, where she is clearing out her mother's things. She's at the depths of despair. She can barely remember her own name. That all makes so much sense to me.
It makes even just the fact that she was clearing out her house of 40 years worth of, because if for anyone who has ever had to move, it's just, moving is one of the worst things. It sounds ridiculous, but it's not until you do it. Moving is one of the worst things that a person can go through. And it's 1926. It's her Annus Horribilis, right? It all happened in 26. And I agree. I think that when you read Unfinished Portrait, she is showing you what her mental state was. And once you gain an appreciation for what her mental state was, I think the degree to which her actions were conscious or subconscious becomes a lot less interesting to me, because she was just in pain. And I understand why she never really wanted to revisit it or explicate what was happening, because I think she probably couldn't. And that goes more toward your theory, which is, some sort of a fugue state or a hysterical fugue, whatever you want to call it. But maybe, who knows? Reality is usually more complicated than that. And I'm sure there were elements of it that were conscious and maybe even vengeful. But I don't, to me, the disappearance, it becomes a mystery why people are even fascinated by it, because it doesn't function like a fictional mystery does. There's no solution. There's nothing that's going to be satisfying about picking it apart anymore, Right.
And, the fact that her friends remained so loyal to her, they did not her friends and family. This is a person who engendered deep loyalties and affection, okay? Someone who doesn't confide, but who wins confidences and wins love and loyalty, and got it, okay? Something we could all hope for in our lives. So that secret is kept. And yet, to me, the great thing is not the depths to which she descended, but the means that she used to crawl out. And boy, she writes a crappy book which earns her money, enables her to pay for her daughter and herself to live independently. And then she goes to the Middle East.
Yep.
She meets the second time Max Mallowan. He's 14 years younger than her?
I believe it's 14. Mm-hmm.
He proposes. She dares to take him on. And they have a whole wonderful new life together. The whole world's open to her. Just as Archie Christie was restricting her world to the golfing life of Sunningdale in the London suburbs and the stockbroker culture and that stifling environment of conventional British life. Yep. Suddenly she's flying around. She is with someone who can speak Arabic, can speak Greek, can do all of this stuff. Her world is enlarged. And why is it? Because she takes active steps.
Yep.
She says, I am not going. She has resilience. And this is where my feminism comes out. I see this because her mother told her when she was a little girl, Agatha, you can be what you like. And she believed it.
Yeah.
That belief that was instilled in her. And the fact that with her mother, she had a relationship. She thought that her mother could read her mind.
Right.
And this is a mind that is closed to everybody else, okay? But her mother could read her mind. And in many ways, this was true. They had an extraordinary connection. Mm-hmm. And so to have a mother, the famous example of, she wants to go up in an airplane, and it's very early in aviation history. Mm-hmm. And her mother has very little spare money, but has had a lot of money. So they used to spend. And her mother says, Agatha, if you want to go up, you shall. And she does. This kind of trust between a mother and a daughter, we get that with Colette and her mother. We get it with Agatha Christie and her mother. This is the kind of relationship that traditionally mothers have given to sons. Freud talks about that all the time, okay? Mother from his mother. Here we have, through strange congeries of circumstances and fortunes and talents, we have women who give that certainty, that confidence to their daughters from day one. And it carries them through. That's my feminist theory.
Yeah, that courage, right? And I think you reference this as well in your book, but it's striking when really reading Christie and reading those mysteries, how often she cites courage as a virtue and not being driven by fear. To be fearful in a Christie novel, there's almost nothing worse. You are not living your life to the fullest or much at all if you are driven by fear in a Christie novel. And I think that, that's something that must have been instilled by her mother. And she almost faltered, right? But then after the divorce, after everything that happened, she did it. And her life just opened up. And then she stepped through, and she was a writer before. I mean, let's not dismiss Roger Ackroyd was before the disappearance, but the career blossomed from there. And how? So
I mean, the novels that she writes in the period of the closest she has with Mallowan and the major pre-Second World War experience of archaeological diggings in Iraq and Syria. Boy, the release of creativity there. I mean, again, sex, we come back to sex. It works for men and women, men need to have sex in order to create. And I think, women probably need it too, or have something related to that. It's a complicated subject, but here I think it works very well. That she and Max are having a great time together all over the world. And she, invites Agatha, this little tiny place that he sets up for her. She sits in front of her typewriter on this rocky table and pours it out.
And that's the genius period. We get that glut of Poirots with some of the Christie crown jewels in there, and ending on, and then there were none right before the war. Not that that there weren't masterpieces to follow, but that is the truly remarkable
that was
period.
The real, absolutely,
the pinnacle.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, this has been absolutely delightful. I could obviously talk about Agatha Christie for hours and hours and hours, especially with you. And you know what? Excellent observation. I have. But I could do it with you specifically for many, many more hours. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast and talking to us about this. And again, I should reiterate, the biography is called Agatha Christie, The Woman and Her Mysteries, Critical Study / Biography, right?
Yes.
by Gillian Gill. And I so appreciate, Gillian, that you came on.
Well, I'm so glad to have had this opportunity of talking.
It's probably going to become a sad running theme on this podcast whenever I do an interview episode, that at the end of it, I will lament the fact that Catherine was not here to conduct the interview with me. But I think in particular, I so wish she had been a part of this one, because I can only imagine the joy Catherine would have taken in talking to Gillian about Archie's gaslighting of Agatha, Christie's treatment of the quote unquote new woman, the importance of leisure time for a female author's creativity, comparing the mother-daughter relationships of Colette and Christie in terms of how close they were. And I know that would have spoken to her on a personal level, given how close Catherine was to her own mother. So I'm really sad that she was not a part of the conversation, but it was still a wonderful conversation nonetheless. And I want to thank Gillian again for coming on. And I really do want to encourage all of you to check out her book. I think you got a sense of what an intelligent and scintillating, even feisty personality she has, which very much comes through in her book. And the deep dives into those 5 novels are just fantastic, especially the Mysterious Affair at Styles, actually, as the first one in the book and Christie's first. She just really picks that one apart. And it's a reminder of how many parts there really are to the Mysterious Affair at Styles, because that was a complicated puzzle mystery. And it is so remarkable that it was Christie's first. So do check out Gillian's book. And thank you again to Lucy Worsley for making that connection. And I have to hope that she will be coming on the podcast when the time is right for her biography of Christie, which is coming out later this year. So more to come on that front. There's just always new material when it comes to Christie, which is good news for me in this podcast. And I suppose all of you as listeners to it. And while we're talking about some good news, our next episode is going to be a Red Banner episode. I have been teasing this for so long, but I will be covering Elephants Can Remember. My co-host for the rankings portion of the episode and the portion of the episode when we speak about the adaptation is going to be Mark Aldridge. How could I pass up the opportunity to talk about the Suchet adaptation of Elephants Can Remember with Mark, since I was going to have him on anyway? So we talk about that, and then we get into that rather interesting late career Christie. So much to discuss on that front. So join me then. And of course, in the meantime, you could always head on over to the podcast's Patreon account. I've provided a link to the notes in this episode, but the URL is www.patreon.com/allaboutagatha. The most recent episode is all about Butter in a Lordly Dish, which is a little-known radio play of Christie's, and I had a lot of fun covering that one. And in next month's episode, in the month of May, I will be talking about the Korean language television drama Ms. Ma, Nemesis, which is truly, truly fascinating. Much more fascinating than I realized it was, actually, when I mentioned it in passing on the Nemesis episode. There's some really interesting adaptational stuff happening in that series as to multiple Miss Marple novels that are woven into a single season of television. So cannot wait to cover that. You could always email me, of course, at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. And you can find the podcast on Twitter at allaboutthedame and on Instagram at allaboutagatha. And I will encourage you, as I always do, to leave a rating and or a review for the podcast wherever you are listening. And I'll see you next time. Bye.